In the scorching heat of a military base in Afghanistan, where tension runs as thick as the desert dust, a single moment of violence would forever change the lives of everyone present. What started as another routine day at Forward Operating Base Kandahar would end with a shocking act of self-defense that left 167 witnesses stunned, a major dead, and a young medic fighting for her freedom. This is the story of Sergeant Sarah Martinez, a decorated combat medic whose split-second decision to defend herself would spark a military investigation, divide public opinion, and ultimately redefine what justice looks like in the armed forces. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The year was 2019, and Sergeant Sarah Martinez had already served 3 tours of duty as a combat medic. At 26 years old, she had seen more violence and trauma than most people witness in a lifetime. Her fellow soldiers respected her, not just for her medical expertise, but for her unwavering courage under fire. She had saved countless lives, pulled wounded soldiers from burning vehicles, and performed life-saving surgeries in makeshift field hospitals while mortar shells exploded overhead. Sarah wasn't just any medic. She was the kind of soldier others looked up to, the one they trusted with their lives when everything went wrong. But there was something else about Sarah that made her unique among her peers. Before enlisting in the military, she had been a competitive martial artist, holding black belts in both karate and Brazilian jiu-jitsu. She had started training at age 8. Following in her father's footsteps. He had been a Marine Corps drill instructor who believed that discipline and physical prowess were essential tools for survival. What her father couldn't have predicted was how these skills would one day save his daughter's life in the most unexpected circumstances. The military base where Sarah was stationed housed over 300 personnel, ranging from fresh-faced recruits to seasoned officers with decades of experience. Among these officers was Major Richard Blackwood, a 42-year-old career military man who commanded respect through fear rather than admiration. Blackwood had been in the service for nearly 20 years, rising through the ranks not because of his leadership abilities, but because he knew how to play the political game that exists within any large organization. He was the kind of officer who demanded absolute obedience, who saw subordinates as tools to be used rather than human beings to be respected. Major Blackwood had a reputation that preceded him wherever he went. Other soldiers whispered about his inappropriate behavior toward female personnel, his explosive temper, and his tendency to abuse his authority. But in the rigid hierarchy of military structure, few dared to speak out against a superior officer. Those who had tried to report his misconduct found their complaints mysteriously lost in paperwork or dismissed due to lack of evidence. The system, it seemed, was designed to protect men like Blackwood, while those he victimized were left to suffer in silence. For months, Blackwood had been watching Sarah with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. It started with lingering stares during briefings, then escalated to unnecessary visits to the medical bay where she worked. He would find excuses to be near her, to comment on her appearance, to make suggestive remarks disguised as casual conversation. Sarah reported these incidents to her immediate supervisor, but like so many before her, she was told to handle it professionally and not make waves. The message was clear. Her discomfort was less important than maintaining the chain of command. The base itself was a sprawling complex of temporary structures, concrete barriers, and endless rows of military vehicles. The medical bay where Sarah worked was located near the center of the compound, a strategic position that allowed for quick access during emergencies. It was a busy place, constantly filled with soldiers seeking treatment for everything from minor injuries to serious combat wounds. The bay consisted of several rooms, an emergency treatment area, a recovery room, medication storage, and a small office where medical records were kept. It was in this office that the confrontation would take place, witnessed by an unprecedented number of personnel who happened to be in the right place at the wrong time. The events leading up to that fateful day began weeks earlier, when Major Blackwood's behavior towards Sarah escalated from uncomfortable to threatening. It was during a routine medical inspection that he first made physical contact, placing his hand on her shoulder in a way that lingered far too long. When Sarah stepped away, Blackwood's eyes flashed with something dark, a mixture of anger and entitlement that sent chills down her spine. That night, she lay awake in her bunk, staring at the ceiling and wondering if she should try reporting the incident again, knowing full well that her previous complaints had gone nowhere. The military base operated on a strict schedule, with personnel moving between duties like clockwork. Morning reveille at 0500, followed by physical training, breakfast, and then the day's assignments. For Sarah, this meant long hours in the medical bay, treating everything from dehydration and heat exhaustion to shrapnel wounds and psychological trauma. She took pride in her work, knowing that her skills and dedication directly impacted the lives of her fellow soldiers. But increasingly, her focus was being disrupted by Major Blackwood's unwanted attention. Other soldiers on the base began to notice the tension between Sarah and the major. Corporal Jake Williams, a fellow medic who worked closely with Sarah, observed how she would tense up whenever Blackwood entered the medical bay. Sarah was always professional, always composed, Jake would later testify. But when that major was around, you could see the change in her body language. She became guarded, alert, like she was preparing for something bad to happen. These observations would prove crucial in the investigation that followed. Private First Class Maria Santos, who worked in communications, had her own experiences with Major Blackwood that she shared with Sarah during one of their rare moments of privacy. "He cornered me in the supply room last month," Maria whispered, her voice trembling with barely contained emotion. "Made it clear that my career advancement depended on my willingness to be cooperative. When I refused, he had me written up for insubordination over the smallest infractions." Maria's story was not unique. Several other women on the base had similar experiences, but fear of retaliation kept them silent. The psychological impact of working under such conditions cannot be understated. Sarah found herself constantly on edge, second-guessing every interaction, every movement through the base. She began varying her routes between buildings, avoiding areas where she might encounter Blackwood alone. She started carrying her medical bag with her at all times, not just because of her duties, but because it gave her something to hold, something that made her feel more secure. The irony was not lost on her that she felt safer in combat zones where the enemy was clearly identified than she did in her own military base. During this period, Sarah's training kicked in not just as a medic, but as a martial artist. She began incorporating more physical exercise into her routine, practicing forms and techniques during her off hours. Other soldiers assumed she was simply staying in shape, but Sarah knew she was preparing for something. Her father had always taught her to trust her instincts, and every instinct she had was screaming that Major Blackwood was a threat that was only going to escalate. The breaking point came during a particularly stressful week in July 2019. The base had received intelligence about potential insurgent activity in the area, putting everyone on high alert. Medical personnel were working longer shifts, treating soldiers who had been injured during increased patrol activities. Sarah had been on duty for nearly 18 hours straight when Major Blackwood appeared in the medical bay late one evening, claiming he needed treatment for a minor cut on his hand. As she examined the wound, which was superficial at best, Blackwood moved closer than necessary, his breath hot against her neck as he spoke in low, threatening tones. "You've been avoiding me, Sergeant," he said, his voice carrying an undertone that made Sarah's blood run cold. "I don't like being ignored. We need to have a private conversation about your attitude and your future in this man's army." The way he emphasized man's army left no doubt about his intentions. Sarah's training as a medic required her to remain professional regardless of personal feelings, but every fiber of her being was screaming, "Danger." She finished treating his minor wound in silence, her hands steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. As she applied the bandage, Blackwood leaned even closer, his lips nearly touching her ear as he whispered, "Tomorrow night, after evening chow, you'll come to my quarters. We'll discuss your career prospects privately.
Don't even think about refusing. You know how these things can go for soldiers who don't follow orders. That night, Sarah sat in her bunk writing a letter to her parents, one she hoped they would never have to read. In it, she detailed everything that had happened, every inappropriate comment, every threatening gesture, and every failed attempt to report the behavior through proper channels. She sealed the letter and gave it to Corporal Williams, asking him to mail it home if anything happened to her. Jake took the letter without question, but the gravity of the situation was evident in his worried expression.
July 23, 2019, began like any other day at Forward Operating Base Kandahar, but the oppressive heat seemed more intense than usual, as if the desert itself was holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. Sarah had barely slept the night before, replaying Major Blackwood's threats in her mind and preparing herself mentally for what she knew was an inevitable confrontation. She had made her decision during the long, sleepless hours before dawn. She would not be going to Blackwood's quarters that evening, regardless of the consequences to her career. The medical bay was busier than usual that morning. A convoy had encountered an improvised explosive device during an early patrol, resulting in several injuries that required immediate attention. Sarah threw herself into her work with characteristic dedication, pushing thoughts of Major Blackwood to the back of her mind as she focused on saving lives. Her skill and professionalism during the emergency earned praise from the attending physician, Captain Rebecca Torres, who would later become a key witness in Sarah's defense. As the morning progressed into afternoon, word spread throughout the base about a special inspection that would take place after evening chow. Such inspections were routine but important events, where personnel gathered to demonstrate their readiness and compliance with military standards. What made this particular inspection unusual was its timing and location. It would take place in the central courtyard, adjacent to the medical bay, with personnel from multiple units required to attend. By 1800 hours, soldiers began gathering information for what would become the largest assembly of personnel the base had seen in months. Representatives from communications, logistics, maintenance, security, and medical units filled the courtyard, creating a sea of uniforms under the still blazing Afghan sun. The gathering included officers, non-commissioned officers, and enlisted personnel from various specialties, totaling exactly 167 individuals who would witness the events that followed. Sarah found herself positioned near the edge of the formation, close to the medical bay where she could respond quickly if anyone needed medical attention during the prolonged outdoor gathering. She noticed Major Blackwood standing with the other senior officers, his eyes scanning the crowd until they found her. When their gazes met, he smiled, a cold, predatory expression that made Sarah's stomach turn. She quickly looked away, focusing instead on the inspection proceedings. The inspection itself was proceeding normally when an unexpected development changed everything. A soldier near the front of the formation collapsed from heat exhaustion, triggering immediate medical protocols. Captain Torres called for Sarah to assist with the medical emergency, directing her to retrieve additional supplies from the medical bay's storage room. As Sarah broke from formation and headed toward the medical facility, she didn't notice Major Blackwood quietly leaving his position and following her. The medical bay's storage room was located in the back of the facility, accessible through the main treatment area. Sarah moved quickly and efficiently, gathering the supplies needed to treat heat exhaustion, IV fluids, cooling packs, and electrolyte supplements. She was focused entirely on her mission to help a fellow soldier in distress, her back turned to the door as she reached for items on the high shelves. It was then that she heard the door close behind her with a soft but definitive click. Sarah spun around to find Major Blackwood standing between her and the exit, his expression no longer attempting to maintain any pretense of professional conduct. The storage room was small, perhaps 8 feet by 10 feet, with metal shelving units lining the walls and medical supplies stacked from floor to ceiling. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, and no one else around to witness what Blackwood clearly had planned. "I told you we needed to have a private conversation," Blackwood said, his voice low and menacing as he stepped closer. "Since you chose to ignore my invitation, I decided to take the initiative." He moved forward, backing Sarah against the shelving unit as she clutched the medical supplies to her chest like a shield. The irony of the situation was not lost on either of them. She was surrounded by tools meant to preserve life, while facing a threat that could destroy hers. "Sir, there's a medical emergency outside. I need to get back to help the patient." She attempted to move toward the door, but Blackwood blocked her path, his larger frame filling the narrow space between the shelving units. "The patient can wait," Blackwood replied, his hand reaching out to touch Sarah's face. "This is more important. You've been playing hard to get for too long, Sergeant. It's time you learned what happens to soldiers who don't follow orders from their superiors." His fingers traced along Sarah's jawline as she recoiled in disgust, pressing herself further back against the metal shelving. Sarah's training as both a medic and a martial artist had taught her to remain calm under pressure, to assess situations quickly and respond appropriately. But this situation was unlike anything she had encountered in combat. This wasn't an enemy soldier or an insurgent. This was supposed to be someone on her side, someone sworn to protect and serve alongside her. The betrayal of trust made the violation even more profound. "Please, sir," Sarah said, still attempting to resolve the situation without violence. "This isn't right. You know this isn't right. Let me go and we can pretend this never happened." Even as she spoke the words, she knew they were futile. Blackwood's expression had moved beyond reason, beyond the point where appeals to his better nature could have any effect. Blackwood's response was to grab Sarah's wrist with one hand while reaching for her uniform with the other. "You don't get to tell me what's right," he snarled. "I'm a major in the United States Army, and you're just another pretty little medic who needs to learn her place. Now stop fighting and make this easy on both of us." It was in that moment that Sarah realized she had exhausted all peaceful options. Her superior officer, someone who had sworn the same oath she had to defend the Constitution and protect American values, was attempting to sexually assault her in a room meant for healing and care. The irony of location was matched only by the tragic irony of the situation itself. A protector becoming a predator. A leader becoming a threat to those under his command. Sarah's martial arts training had taught her to remain calm under pressure, to assess situations quickly and respond appropriately. But this situation was unlike anything she had encountered in combat. This was a last resort. As Major Blackwood's hands moved to tear at her uniform, as his weight pressed her against the medical supplies, Sarah Martinez made the split-second decision that would change both their lives. The months of harassment, the failed reports, the system that had refused to protect her, it all crystallized into a moment of clarity where survival instinct overrode everything else.
What happened next unfolded in mere seconds, but those seconds would be dissected and analyzed for months to come. Sarah Martinez, trapped in that storage room with Major Blackwood's hands tearing at her uniform, felt something shift inside her mind. A transition from victim to survivor that her martial arts training had prepared her for, but which she had never hoped to use. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Sometimes, Sarah, the only way to stop a predator is to make them understand that you're not prey." As Blackwood pressed his body against hers, attempting to pin her against the shelving unit, Sarah's extensive training in Brazilian jiu-jitsu and karate activated with muscle memory precision. She had spent thousands of hours practicing these movements, drilling them until they became as natural as breathing. But this wasn't a sparring match or a competition. This was life and death, and her body responded accordingly. Sarah's first movement was subtle but effective. She shifted her weight and dropped her center of gravity, creating space between herself and Blackwood while simultaneously disrupting his balance. The medical supplies she had been holding scattered to the floor as she brought her hands up in a defensive position. Blackwood, apparently interpreting this as submission rather than preparation, leaned forward with increased aggression. "That's more like it," he growled, his hands reaching for her throat. "Just relax and this will all be over soon." Those words would be the last he ever spoke. As his hands made contact with Sarah's neck, every instinct she possessed screamed danger. In her training, attacks to the throat were considered potentially lethal threats that justified maximum defensive response. Sarah's countermove was a technique she had practiced thousands of times but never used in actual combat. As Blackwood's hands closed around her throat, she brought her arms up between his, breaking his grip while simultaneously stepping to his right side. Her left hand shot up to cup the back of his head, while her right forearm pressed against his throat, a position martial artists call a standing rear naked choke, or sleeper hold. But what Sarah executed was far more than a simple chokehold. Years of training had taught her the precise anatomy of the human neck, the location of the carotid arteries that supplied blood to the brain, and the exact pressure points that could render an opponent unconscious within seconds. What she hadn't counted on was the combination of adrenaline, fear, and Blackwood's own violent resistance, turning her defensive technique into something lethal. Major Blackwood, realizing he was now in a compromised position, began thrashing violently in an attempt to break free from Sarah's grip. His superior size and weight, he outweighed Sarah by nearly 80 pounds, worked against him as he threw his body backwards, trying to crush her against the shelving unit. The metal structures groaned under the impact, medical supplies cascading to the floor as the two bodies crashed into the storage area. It was during this violent struggle that the fatal injury occurred. As Blackwood threw his weight backward with tremendous force, Sarah maintained her grip as she had been trained to do, but the sudden motion combined with the impact against the shelving created a torque force that exceeded what the human neck could withstand. The distinctive sound that followed, described by forensic experts as similar to a thick branch snapping, would haunt Sarah's memories for the rest of her life. Major Blackwood's body went instantly limp, his full weight collapsing onto Sarah and pinning her against the destroyed shelving unit. For several seconds, Sarah didn't understand what had happened. She had expected him to lose consciousness from the chokehold. That was the intended outcome of her defensive technique. But the complete limpness of his body, the unnatural angle of his head, and the sudden, absolute silence told a different story. "Sir?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible in the sudden stillness of the storage room. "Major Blackwood?" She pushed his body off of her, noting with growing horror the way his head moved independently of his shoulders. Her medical training immediately identified what her defensive actions had accomplished: a complete cervical spine fracture, specifically a break between the second and third vertebrae that had severed his spinal cord at the brainstem. Sarah knelt beside Blackwood's body, her medic instincts overriding everything else as she checked for vital signs she knew she wouldn't find. There was no pulse, no respiration, no response to stimuli. The man who had attempted to assault her moments earlier was dead, and she was responsible. The weight of that realization hit her like a physical blow, even as she understood that she had acted purely in self-defense. The storage room had been transformed from a place of healing supplies into a crime scene. Medical equipment lay scattered across the floor, shelving units had been damaged or destroyed, and in the center of it all lay the body of a major in the United States Army. Sarah sat back against the wall, staring at her hands as if they belonged to someone else, unable to fully process what had just occurred. Outside, she could hear the sounds of the ongoing inspection, the voices of 167 soldiers who had no idea that everything had just changed. Captain Torres would be wondering where she was, why she hadn't returned with the medical supplies for the heat exhaustion patient. Soon, someone would come looking for her, and then the nightmare would truly begin. Sarah's military training told her to secure the scene and report the incident immediately. Her survival instincts told her to run, to find a way to escape the base before anyone discovered what had happened. But her moral compass, the same internal guide that had led her to become a medic and dedicate her life to saving others, told her to face the consequences of her actions, regardless of what those consequences might be. She stood slowly, stepped carefully around Blackwood's body, and opened the storage room door.
The sounds of the inspection grew louder as she walked through the medical bay, her steps automatic and measured despite the chaos in her mind. She could see the formation of soldiers through the window, Captain Torres treating the heat exhaustion patient with supplies from the emergency kit, everything appearing normal and routine. But nothing would ever be normal again. Sarah Martinez, who had saved countless lives during her military service, had just taken one. The fact that she had acted in self-defense against a sexual assault would be for others to determine. All she knew was that a man was dead by her hand, and 167 witnesses were about to discover that their quiet military base had become the scene of a homicide.
The next few minutes unfolded with the surreal quality of a nightmare. Sarah Martinez stood at the entrance to the medical bay, watching the formation of soldiers outside, knowing that her next actions would set in motion a chain of events that could not be undone. Her hands, still steady from years of medical training, began to shake as the full implications of what had just occurred began to sink in. Captain Rebecca Torres was the first to notice something was wrong. As the attending physician overseeing the medical emergency, she had been expecting Sarah to return with the additional supplies within minutes. When 15 minutes passed without Sarah's return, Torres began to worry, not about insubordination or neglect of duty, but about Sarah's well-being. In the high-stress environment of a military base, unexplained delays often meant something had gone wrong. Corporal Williams, Torres called to Jake Williams, Sarah's closest colleague in the medical unit. Go check on Sergeant Martinez. She should have been back with those supplies by now. Jake nodded and jogged toward the medical bay, unaware that he was about to become the first witness to discover the aftermath of Major Blackwood's attempted assault. Sarah heard Jake's footsteps approaching and made her decision. She could have hidden, could have tried to clean up the storage room, could have attempted to create an alternative explanation for what Jake was about to find. Instead, she chose honesty, a decision that would ultimately save her from charges of premeditated murder, but would subject her to months of investigation and scrutiny. Jake, Sarah called out as he entered the medical bay, I need you to radio Captain Torres immediately. Tell her we have a code black in the storage room. Code Black was military terminology for a death on base, a signal that would immediately mobilize command staff and investigators. Jake's expression shifted from concern to alarm as he processed Sarah's words. Sarah, what happened? Are you injured? Jake's eyes scanned Sarah for signs of injury, noting her disheveled uniform and the scratches on her arms from the struggle against the shelving unit. His medical training kicked in as he moved toward her, but Sarah held up a hand to stop him. I'm not injured, but Major Blackwood is dead. He attacked me in the storage room. I defended myself. It was an accident, but he's dead. The words felt surreal coming out of her mouth, as if she were reporting on someone else's actions rather than her own. Jake's face went pale as the implications hit him. He had witnessed Blackwood's inappropriate behavior towards Sarah, had seen her growing distress over the past weeks, had even been entrusted with her letter home detailing the harassment. Now his worst fears had been realized in a way none of them could have anticipated. Jesus, Sarah, Jake whispered, pulling out his radio with shaking hands. Stay right here. Don't move. Don't touch anything else. Don't talk to anyone until Captain Torres gets here. His training as a military medic included basic crime scene preservation, and he immediately understood the importance of maintaining the integrity of whatever evidence existed in that storage room. Jake's radio call to Captain Torres was brief and professional. Captain, we have a code black in the medical base storage room. Request immediate assistance and notification of command staff. The response was immediate. Captain Torres acknowledged the call and began the protocol for reporting a death on base, which included notification of the commanding officer, military police, and criminal investigation division. Within minutes, the peaceful routine of the evening inspection was shattered by the sound of sirens and the sight of military police vehicles racing toward the medical bay. Colonel Michael Harrison, the base commanding officer, cut short the inspection and ordered all personnel to return to their units while maintaining readiness for further orders. The 167 soldiers who had gathered for inspection were now potential witnesses to whatever had occurred, though most of them didn't know yet why. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Captain Torres arrived at the medical bay with a team of medical personnel and military police, her expression grim as she processed what Jake had told her over the radio. Sarah stood exactly where Jake had left her military bearing intact despite the emotional turmoil she was experiencing. Torres approached Sarah with the careful demeanor of someone who understood that she was dealing with both a victim and a potential perpetrator. "Sergeant Martinez," Torres said, her voice professional but not unkind, "I need you to understand that everything you say from this point forward will be part of an official investigation. Do you understand?" Sarah nodded, understanding her legal rights as a service member, clear in her mind despite the circumstances. "Ma'am, Major Blackwood attacked me in the storage room. He had been harassing me for months, making threats about my career if I didn't comply with his demands. Tonight, he cornered me in the storage room and physically assaulted me. I defended myself using techniques I learned in martial arts training. His death was accidental, but it occurred during my defense against his assault." The words felt surreal coming out of her mouth, as if she were reporting on someone else's actions rather than her own. First Sergeant Robert Chen, the base's senior military police investigator, arrived within 10 minutes of the initial call. A 20-year veteran with extensive experience in criminal investigations immediately recognized the complexity of the situation he was facing. A major was dead, killed by a subordinate under circumstances that suggested both sexual assault and self-defense. The case would require careful handling to ensure justice for all parties involved. "Sergeant Martinez," First Sergeant Chen said as he approached Sarah, "I'm placing you under protective custody pending a full investigation of this incident. This is not an arrest, but I need to ensure your safety and the integrity of our investigation. Do you understand?" Sarah nodded, understanding her military career and possibly her freedom now hung in the balance. As Sarah was escorted to a secure room for formal questioning, word of the incident began spreading throughout the base, despite official efforts to maintain operational security. In the close-knit environment of a military installation, news traveled fast, and the death of a major under mysterious circumstances was impossible to keep quiet. Soldiers whispered in mess halls and barracks, speculation running wild about what had happened in that storage room. The 167 witnesses who had been present at the inspection found themselves questioned about what they had observed, particularly regarding the whereabouts and behavior of both Sarah Martinez and Major Blackwood during the evening's events. Most had little information to offer. They had been focused on the inspection and the medical emergency involving the heat exhaustion victim, but several key witnesses would emerge whose testimony would prove crucial to Sarah's case. The investigation into Major Blackwood's death began immediately, with military criminal investigators working through the night to document the scene, interview witnesses, and piece together the events that had led to a superior officer's death at the hands of a subordinate. The storage room became a forensic laboratory, with investigators photographing every detail, measuring distances, and collecting physical evidence that would either support or contradict Sarah's account of self-defense. The physical evidence told a compelling story. The damaged shelving units, scattered medical supplies, and the position of Blackwood's body all supported Sarah's description of a violent struggle in confined quarters. Forensic analysis of the injuries to both Sarah and Blackwood painted a picture of a desperate fight rather than a premeditated attack. Sarah's scratches and bruises were consistent with someone who had been pinned against metal shelving, while the pattern of Blackwood's injuries suggested he had been the aggressor in the initial phase of the encounter. Dr. Amanda Foster, the base's chief medical officer and a forensic pathologist by training, conducted the preliminary examination of Blackwood's body. Her findings would prove crucial to understanding exactly what had occurred in those final moments. Quote, "The cause of death was a complete fracture of the second cervical vertebra, resulting in immediate severance of the spinal cord at the brainstem," Dr. Foster reported. "This type of injury, while fatal, is consistent with a defensive martial arts technique executed under extreme stress and resistance from the victim." Unquote. What made Dr. Foster's findings particularly significant was her analysis of the biomechanics involved in Blackwood's death.
Quote, "The angle and force of the fracture indicates that Sergeant Martinez was not in an offensive position when the fatal injury occurred," she explained to investigators. Rather, she appears to have been defending herself from a larger, stronger attacker who was throwing his weight backward in an attempt to break free from a defensive hold. The fatal injury occurred when Major Blackwood's own violent resistance created forces that exceeded what the human neck can withstand, unquote. As news of the investigation spread throughout the military hierarchy, Sarah's case attracted attention from the highest levels of command. General Patricia Hawthorne, commanding officer of the entire theater of operations, ordered a comprehensive review of all harassment complaints filed on the base over the previous 2 years. What investigators discovered was a pattern of behavior from Major Blackwood that painted him as a serial predator who had used his rank and authority to victimize female personnel with impunity. The letter Sarah had given to Corporal Williams proved to be just the beginning of a paper trail that investigators would follow for weeks. Private First Class Maria Santos, emboldened by Sarah's courage and the seriousness of the investigation, came forward with her own detailed account of Blackwood's harassment and threats. Her testimony was particularly damaging because she had documented several incidents with dates, times, and witness names, evidence that had been previously ignored by the command structure. Quote, "Major Blackwood cornered me in the communications room on June 15th. He made it clear that my chances for promotion and favorable assignments depended on my willingness to provide him with personal services. When I refused, he began writing me up for minor infractions and giving me undesirable duty assignments. I reported this to my supervisor, but was told to handle it quietly and not make accusations against a superior officer," unquote. Staff Sergeant Lisa Rodriguez, who worked in the base's administrative offices, provided testimony that revealed the systematic way harassment complaints against Major Blackwood had been buried. Quote, "I processed at least 6 formal complaints against Major Blackwood in the past 18 months, Rodriguez told investigators. Each time I was ordered by Colonel Peterson, the deputy commanding officer, to file them as pending review and not to pursue them further. When I asked about the status of these complaints, I was told they were being handled at higher levels, but no follow-up ever occurred," unquote. Colonel Peterson's testimony himself proved to be one of the most damaging aspects of the investigation. When confronted with evidence of the suppressed harassment complaints, Peterson initially denied knowledge of any systematic problems with Major Blackwood's behavior. However, when presented with Rodriguez's documentation and testimony from multiple witnesses, Peterson was forced to admit that he had indeed received and deliberately suppressed complaints against Blackwood. Quote, "Major Blackwood was considered valuable to our operations. He had connections at higher levels of command and was being considered for promotion to lieutenant colonel. The complaints against him were seen as potentially career damaging, not just to him, but to the officers who had endorsed his advancement. I was advised by legal counsel that without conclusive proof of wrongdoing, it was better to handle these matters through counseling and administrative actions rather than formal disciplinary procedures," unquote. Peterson's testimony revealed the toxic culture that had allowed Blackwood's predatory behavior to continue unchecked. The Good Old Boys Network within the military hierarchy had closed ranks to protect one of their own, even at the expense of the women under their command. Sarah Martinez had not been the first victim of Blackwood's harassment. She had simply been the first with the training and courage to fight back effectively. Corporal Jake Williams provided crucial testimony about Sarah's state of mind in the weeks leading up to the incident. Quote, "Sarah was scared. She tried to hide it, tried to maintain her professional demeanor, but I could see the stress wearing on her. She asked me to hold on to a letter for her family just in case something happened. That's not normal behavior for someone like Sarah. She was always confident, always in control, but this situation with Major Blackwood had her genuinely frightened for her safety," unquote. The investigation also uncovered evidence of Blackwood's escalating behavior in the days immediately before his death. Security camera footage from various locations around the base showed Blackwood following Sarah on multiple occasions, timing his movements to coincide with hers in a pattern that suggested deliberate stalking behavior. Expert analysis of this footage would later be used to establish premeditation on Blackwood's part, not for murder, but for the sexual assault that ultimately led to his death.
Perhaps the most compelling witness testimony came from Sergeant First Class David Kim, who had been positioned near the medical bay during the inspection and had actually heard portions of the struggle in the storage room. Quote, "I heard what sounded like medical equipment falling, then voices, a man's voice that sounded angry or threatening, and a woman's voice that sounded frightened. Then there was a loud crash, like someone hitting the metal shelving hard, followed by complete silence. I thought about investigating, but the sound stopped, so I assumed someone had just knocked over some supplies while retrieving equipment for the medical emergency," unquote. Kim's testimony was particularly valuable because it provided an independent timeline of events that corroborated Sarah's account. The loud crash, he described, matched exactly with Sarah's description of Blackwood throwing his weight backward against the shelving units, the movement that ultimately resulted in the fatal neck injury. The sequence of sounds Kim heard supported the narrative of a struggle that escalated quickly and ended abruptly with Blackwood's death. The 167 soldiers who had been present at the inspection became unwitting witnesses to the events leading up to the confrontation. While most had not observed the actual incident, their collective testimony helped establish the timeline and circumstances that preceded it. Several soldiers recalled seeing Blackwood leave the formation shortly after Sarah had been called to assist with the medical emergency. Others noted that Blackwood had seemed agitated or distracted during the inspection, behavior that was unusual for an officer of his rank and experience. Master Sergeant Franklin Torres, the non-commissioned officer in charge of the inspection, provided testimony that proved particularly damaging to any suggestion that Sarah had planned or premeditated violence against Major Blackwood. Quote, "Sergeant Martinez was completely focused on her medical duties. When the soldier collapsed from heat exhaustion, she responded immediately and professionally. Her only concern was getting the necessary supplies to treat the patient. There was nothing in her behavior or demeanor to suggest she was planning anything other than providing medical care," unquote. The investigation also uncovered the extent to which other female personnel on the base had been living in fear of Major Blackwood. Specialist Jennifer Walsh came forward with a disturbing account of an incident that had occurred just weeks before Blackwood's death. Quote, "He trapped me in the equipment shed after evening chow, started making comments about my body, asking personal questions about my relationships. When I tried to leave, he blocked the door and made it clear that my cooperation would determine whether I received favorable treatment or found myself facing disciplinary infractions for imaginary infractions," unquote. These testimonies painted a picture of systematic sexual harassment that had created a climate of fear among female personnel on the base. What made the situation even more tragic was the evidence that multiple women had attempted to report Blackwood's behavior through proper channels, only to have their complaints suppressed or ignored by the command structure. Sarah Martinez had not been an isolated victim. She had simply been the final victim in a pattern of predatory behavior that should have been stopped long before it escalated to violence.
As the investigation into Major Blackwood's death entered its second week, the military legal system began the complex process of determining what charges, if any, would be filed against Sergeant Sarah Martinez. The case presented unprecedented challenges for military prosecutors and defense attorneys alike. While the physical evidence clearly supported Sarah's account of self-defense, the fact remained that a subordinate had killed a superior officer, a situation that struck at the very heart of military hierarchy and discipline. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, the senior military prosecutor assigned to the case, found himself in an extremely difficult position. The evidence overwhelmingly supported Sarah's claim of self-defense against sexual assault, yet military law required that he consider charges related to the death of a superior officer. This case challenges every assumption we make about military justice, Morrison confided to his staff. We have clear evidence of justified self-defense, but we also have a dead major and a living sergeant. The question isn't what happened, it's how the military justice system responds to what happened. The decision to convene a formal court-martial was not taken lightly. General Patricia Hawthorne, after reviewing the complete investigation file, faced a choice that would set precedent for how the military handled similar cases in the future. She could recommend that charges be dismissed based on the self-defense evidence, but doing so might be seen as encouraging violence against superior officers.
Alternatively, she could proceed with court-martial proceedings, risking the perception that the military was punishing a victim of sexual assault for defending herself. General Hawthorne's decision was heavily influenced by the testimony of the 167 witnesses and the broader investigation into the culture of harassment on the base. This case is not just about Sergeant Martinez and Major Blackwood, she stated in her official recommendation for court-martial proceedings. It's about whether the United States military will tolerate a culture where sexual predators are protected by rank and victims are left with no recourse but violence. We will proceed with a full court-martial, not to punish Sergeant Martinez, but to ensure that the truth is heard and that justice is served for all parties involved. Sarah's defense team, led by Major Patricia Chen, an experienced military defense attorney, faced the challenge of presenting a case that would satisfy both legal requirements and public perception. Major Chen had handled numerous cases involving sexual assault in the military and understood the systemic issues that had led to Sarah's desperate situation. Our defense strategy is straightforward, Chen explained to Sarah during one of their preparation sessions. We're going to show that you acted in justified self-defense against a sexual assault and that your actions were the direct result of a command structure that failed to protect you when you sought help through proper channels. The court-martial proceedings were scheduled to take place at the base's legal facilities, with a panel of military officers serving as both judge and jury. The selection of this panel became a crucial element of the case, as both prosecution and defense worked to ensure that the officers chosen would be capable of rendering a fair verdict despite the complex emotions and military politics surrounding the case. Colonel Margaret Stevens was selected as the presiding officer for the court-martial, a choice that reflected the military's commitment to having the case heard by someone with both legal expertise and understanding of the unique challenges faced by women in the armed forces. Stevens had served for over 20 years and had been instrumental in developing new policies for handling sexual harassment complaints within the military hierarchy. The prosecution's case focused on the undeniable fact that Sarah had killed a superior officer, arguing that, regardless of the circumstances, military discipline required that such actions be subject to formal legal proceedings. We are not here to condemn Sergeant Martinez, Prosecutor Morrison said in his opening remarks. We are here to determine whether her actions, while understandable, were justified under military law. The death of Major Blackwood, regardless of his behavior, represents a breakdown in the chain of command that cannot be ignored. However, the prosecution's case was significantly weakened by the overwhelming evidence of Blackwood's predatory behavior and the command structure's failure to address it. Morrison found himself in the unusual position of having to acknowledge the victim's misconduct while still arguing for accountability in his death. This delicate balancing act would prove to be the prosecution's greatest challenge throughout the proceedings. The defense strategy centered on demonstrating that Sarah had exhausted all legitimate channels for addressing Blackwood's harassment before being forced to defend herself physically. Major Chen presented detailed testimony about Sarah's previous complaints, the command structure's failure to investigate or address them, and the escalating nature of Blackwood's threats that culminated in the attempted sexual assault. Sergeant Martinez did everything right, Major Chen argued in her opening statement. She reported harassment through proper channels. She documented incidents. She sought help from her supervisors. At every turn, she was told to handle the situation quietly, not to make waves, to protect the reputation of the unit and the officer who was victimizing her. When the system failed her completely, when she found herself trapped in a room with a man who was attempting to rape her, she did what any reasonable person would do. She defended herself. The testimony of the 167 witnesses who had been present at the inspection proved crucial in establishing the timeline and circumstances that led to the confrontation. While none of them had witnessed the actual incident in the storage room, their collective testimony painted a picture of a routine military operation that was interrupted by a medical emergency, creating the opportunity for Blackwood to corner Sarah away from other personnel. Corporal Jake Williams' testimony was particularly powerful, as he described finding Sarah immediately after the incident and her immediate honesty about what had occurred. Sarah could have lied, she could have claimed it was an accident, that the major had fallen and hit his head, any number of stories. But she told me the truth immediately, that he had attacked her and she had defended herself. That's not the behavior of someone who committed murder. That's the behavior of someone who was traumatized by what she had been forced to do. The medical testimony provided by Dr. Amanda Foster proved to be one of the most crucial elements of the defense case. Her detailed analysis of the biomechanics involved in Blackwood's death demonstrated conclusively that Sarah was not in an offensive position when the fatal injury occurred. The angle and force of the cervical fracture is consistent with a defensive technique that went wrong due to the victim's own violent resistance. Sergeant Martinez was attempting to subdue an attacker, not to kill him. Perhaps most damaging to any remaining credibility of the command structure's handling of the situation was the testimony of Staff Sergeant Lissa Rodriguez about the systematic suppression of harassment complaints against Major Blackwood. Her revelation that at least 6 formal complaints had been deliberately buried by Colonel Peterson created a scandal that extended far beyond Sarah's individual case.
The court-martial proceedings entered their most critical phase when expert witnesses began testifying about the psychological and physical dynamics of sexual assault and self-defense. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a clinical psychologist specializing in military sexual trauma, no relation to Sarah, provided testimony that helped the court understand the mental state of someone facing imminent sexual assault after months of harassment and threats. Sergeant Martinez was experiencing what we call learned helplessness in the weeks leading up to this incident, Dr. Martinez testified. She had repeatedly attempted to address Major Blackwood's harassment through official channels, only to be told that her complaints would not be investigated. This creates a psychological state where the victim believes that help will not come from authority figures, leading to increased hypervigilance and defensive responses when threats escalate. Dr. Martinez's testimony was particularly important in helping the court understand why Sarah had not simply reported Blackwood's final threat to visit his quarters, rather than waiting for him to act on it. When someone has been systematically let down by the very system that's supposed to protect them, they often feel that they have no choice but to handle threats on their own. This doesn't represent poor judgment. It represents a rational response to a system that has proven unreliable. The psychological expert also testified about the trauma response that occurs during sexual assault, explaining how the fight or flight response can lead to actions that might seem disproportionate to outside observers, but are actually normal defensive reactions to life-threatening situations. When someone is sexually assaulted, their brain processes it as a life-threatening attack, because historically and statistically, sexual assault often escalates to severe physical violence or murder. Sergeant Martinez's defensive response was proportionate to the threat she was facing, not just in that moment, but as someone who had been systematically hunted by a sexual predator for months. Master Sergeant Antonio Rodriguez, a martial arts instructor with over 15 years of experience training military personnel in hand-to-hand combat, provided expert testimony about the techniques Sarah had used and their intended purpose. The hold that Sergeant Martinez applied is taught as a non-lethal restraint technique, Rodriguez testified. It's designed to render an attacker unconscious quickly without causing permanent injury. The fatal outcome in this case was caused by Major Blackwood's violent resistance and the confined space where the struggle occurred, not by any intent to kill on Sergeant Martinez's part. Rodriguez's testimony was supported by video demonstrations showing how the technique was supposed to work under normal circumstances compared to what happened when combined with Blackwood's violent backward motion against the shelving units. If Major Blackwood had simply gone unconscious, as the technique is designed to accomplish, he would have suffered no permanent injury. The fatal neck fracture occurred because he threw his full body weight backward, while Sergeant Martinez maintained her grip as she had been trained to do. It was a tragic accident that occurred during a legitimate act of self-defense. The court also heard testimony from former victims of sexual assault in military settings, who testified about the long-term effects of harassment and the difficulty of seeking help within the military hierarchy.
These witnesses, while not directly related to Sarah's case, helped the court understand the broader context in which the incident had occurred. Captain Jennifer Walsh, who had previously testified about her own experiences with Major Blackwood's harassment, provided emotional testimony about the fear and isolation that victims experience when the system fails to protect them. You start to feel like you're completely alone, like no one will believe you, no one will help you, and if something terrible happens, it will be your fault for not somehow preventing it. That's the mindset that Major Blackwood and the command structure created for all of us. The defense team also called character witnesses who testified about Sarah's exemplary service record and her reputation as both a skilled medic and a person of integrity. Colonel Patricia Hayes, who had commanded Sarah during her previous deployment, testified about her dedication to saving lives and her courage under fire. Sergeant Martinez once ran into a building that was under enemy fire to rescue wounded soldiers. She risked her life repeatedly to save others. The idea that she would kill someone except in the most desperate circumstances is simply inconsistent with everything I know about her character. If Sarah Martinez killed someone, it was because she absolutely had no other choice. The prosecution's case continued to weaken as witness after witness testified about Blackwood's predatory behavior and the command structure's failure to address it. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison found himself in the increasingly difficult position of arguing for accountability while acknowledging that the victim had been failed by the very system he represented. Morrison's strategy shifted to arguing that regardless of the circumstances, military discipline required formal consequences for the death of a superior officer, even in cases of justified self-defense. We cannot set a precedent that allows subordinates to kill their superiors, even when those superiors are committing crimes, Morrison argued. Military discipline depends on respect for the chain of command, and that respect cannot survive if we excuse violence against superior officers, regardless of the justification. However, this argument was significantly undermined by the revelation that Major Blackwood had been recommended for promotion despite the multiple harassment complaints against him. The prosecution's argument about maintaining military discipline ran hollow when the evidence showed that the military hierarchy had been protecting a sexual predator at the expense of his victims. The turning point in the trial came when Colonel Peterson, the deputy commanding officer who had suppressed the harassment complaints, was called to testify. Under cross-examination by Major Chen, Peterson was forced to admit that he had prioritized Blackwood's career advancement over the safety of female personnel under his command. Did you consider the possibility that your failure to investigate complaints against Major Blackwood might lead to escalation of his predatory behavior? Major Chen asked during cross-examination. I believe that administrative counseling would be sufficient to address any inappropriate behavior, Peterson replied, his voice barely audible. Did you consider the possibility that your failure to act might put female soldiers in danger? Peterson's long pause before answering spoke volumes about his awareness of the consequences of his inaction. I believed we were handling the situation appropriately given the available evidence. Colonel, isn't it true that you were more concerned about protecting Major Blackwood's promotion prospects than protecting the women under your command? Peterson's inability to provide a convincing answer to this question effectively ended any remaining credibility for the command structure's handling of the harassment complaints.
After 3 weeks of testimony, expert analysis, and legal arguments, the court-martial panel retired to deliberate on the charges against Sergeant Sarah Martinez. The case had captured national attention, with media outlets, veterans organizations, and advocacy groups following every development. The verdict would not only determine Sarah's fate, but would also set important precedents for how the military justice system handles cases involving sexual assault and self-defense. The deliberation process took 2 full days, reflecting the complexity of the legal and moral issues involved in the case. The panel of officers had to weigh the undeniable fact that a subordinate had killed a superior officer against the overwhelming evidence that she had acted in justified self-defense against attempted rape. They also had to consider the broader implications of their verdict for military discipline and the protection of sexual assault victims. Colonel Margaret Stevens, the presiding officer, later described the deliberation as one of the most difficult decisions of her military career.
We had to balance the need to maintain military discipline with the recognition that Sergeant Martinez was the victim of a systematic failure by her chain of command, Stevens explained. The evidence clearly showed that she had exhausted all proper channels for addressing Major Blackwood's harassment and was left with no choice but to defend herself when he escalated to physical assault. When the court reconvened to announce the verdict, the courtroom was packed with spectators, including many of the 167 soldiers who had been witnesses to the events leading up to the incident. Sarah sat with her defense team, her expression composed despite the enormous stress she had endured throughout the proceedings. Her parents had flown in from the United States to support her, sitting in the front row behind the defense table. Colonel Stevens announced the verdict in a clear, steady voice that carried throughout the silent courtroom. On the charge of voluntary manslaughter, we find the defendant not guilty. On the charge of conduct unbecoming an officer or non-commissioned officer, we find the defendant not guilty. On all charges and specifications, Sergeant Sarah Martinez is hereby acquitted. The courtroom erupted in applause and cheers from Sarah supporters, while the prosecution team sat in stunned silence. Sarah herself showed little emotion, simply nodding as Major Chen placed a supportive hand on her shoulder. The verdict represented a complete vindication of her actions and a clear statement that the court-martial panel believed she had acted appropriately given the circumstances she faced. In explaining the verdict, Colonel Stevens delivered a statement that would become a landmark in military justice. This panel finds that Sergeant Martinez acted in justified self-defense against a sexual assault by Major Blackwood. Furthermore, we find that her actions were the direct result of a systematic failure by the command structure to protect her when she sought help through proper channels. While we deeply regret the death of Major Blackwood, we cannot ignore the evidence that he was attempting to rape Sergeant Martinez when the fatal injury occurred. Stevens continued with words that sent shockwaves through the military hierarchy. This case highlights serious deficiencies in how the military handles sexual harassment complaints and protects victims from predatory behavior. The evidence shows that multiple women were victimized by Major Blackwood, while their complaints were systematically suppressed by senior officers who prioritized his career over their safety. This cannot be allowed to continue. The verdict was immediately appealed by the prosecution, but the appeal was rejected at every level, ultimately reaching the Secretary of Defense, who upheld the acquittal and ordered a comprehensive review of sexual harassment policies throughout the military. Sarah's case had become a catalyst for systemic change in how the armed forces handled sexual assault and harassment complaints. The aftermath of the verdict saw immediate consequences for the officers who had failed to address Blackwood's predatory behavior. Colonel Peterson was court-martialed for dereliction of duty and conduct unbecoming an officer, ultimately resulting in his dismissal from the service and loss of pension benefits. Several other officers who had been involved in suppressing harassment complaints faced disciplinary action ranging from formal reprimands to forced retirement. General Patricia Hawthorne, who had ordered the court-martial proceedings, used the case as an opportunity to implement sweeping reforms in how sexual harassment complaints were handled. Sergeant Martinez should never have been put in a position where violence was her only option for protection, Hawthorne stated. We failed her, and we failed every other woman who was victimized by Major Blackwood. That failure ends now. The new policies implemented as a result of Sarah's case included independent investigation of all sexual harassment complaints, mandatory training for all officers on proper handling of such complaints, and severe consequences for any officer found to have suppressed or mishandled harassment reports. These changes were implemented not just at Sarah's base, but throughout the entire military structure. Sarah's legal victory was complete, but the emotional and psychological impact of the incident continued to affect her long after the verdict was announced. She had been cleared of all charges and was free to continue her military career, but the trauma of killing another human being, even in self-defense, was something she would have to live with for the rest of her life. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the psychologist who had testified in Sarah's defense, continued to work with her on processing the trauma of the incident. Winning the court-martial was important for legal and professional reasons, but it doesn't erase the psychological impact of having to kill someone to protect yourself. Sarah will need ongoing support to deal with the complex emotions surrounding this incident. The 167 witnesses who had been present at the inspection also felt the impact of the case, many of them testifying that it had changed their understanding of sexual harassment in the military and their responsibility to speak out when they witnessed inappropriate behavior. Several of them became advocates for reform, using their experiences to push for better protection of sexual assault victims within the military structure. Sarah's story became a rallying point for advocates of military sexual assault reform, but she herself remained reluctant to take on a public role as a spokesperson for the cause. "I never wanted to be a symbol or a poster child," Sarah explained in a rare interview after her acquittal. "I just wanted to serve my country and do my job as a medic. What happened with Major Blackwood was something I had to survive, not something I chose to happen."
The acquittal of Sergeant Sarah Martinez marked the beginning of the most comprehensive reform of military sexual assault policies in decades. Her case had exposed not just the predatory behavior of one officer, but an entire system that had allowed such behavior to flourish while silencing victims who sought help. The 167 witnesses to the events of that day had become unwitting participants in a landmark case that would reshape how the military handled sexual harassment and assault complaints. Within 6 months of Sarah's acquittal, Congress passed the Military Sexual Assault Reform Act, legislation that had been stalled in committee for years but gained overwhelming support in the wake of Sarah's case. The act established independent prosecutors for sexual assault cases, removed the authority of commanding officers to dismiss such cases, and created mandatory minimum sentences for officers who suppressed or mishandled harassment complaints. Senator Patricia Williams, who sponsored the legislation, specifically cited Sarah's case during floor debates. Sergeant Martinez was forced to choose between being raped and defending herself with lethal force because the system that was supposed to protect her had completely failed. "We cannot allow another service member to face such an impossible choice. This legislation ensures that sexual predators in uniform will face justice, not protection from their cronies in the command structure." The changes went beyond legislation to include fundamental shifts in military culture and training. The Good Old Boys network that had protected Major Blackwood was systematically dismantled, with senior officers throughout the military facing scrutiny for their handling of previous harassment complaints. Many careers ended as investigators uncovered patterns of suppressed complaints and protected predators similar to what had occurred at Sarah's base. General Patricia Hawthorne, who had ordered Sarah's court-martial, became one of the leading advocates for reform within the military hierarchy. Sergeant Martinez's case was a wake-up call that we could no longer ignore, Hawthorne explained during congressional testimony. "We had created a system where victims were punished for speaking out while predators were rewarded with promotions. That system was not just morally wrong, it was operationally dangerous, creating division and mistrust within our ranks." The changes went beyond legislation to include fundamental shifts in military culture and training. The Good Old Boys network that had protected Major Blackwood was systematically dismantled, with senior officers throughout the military facing scrutiny for their handling of previous harassment complaints. Many careers ended as investigators uncovered patterns of suppressed complaints and protected predators similar to what had occurred at Sarah's base. Master Sergeant Antonio Rodriguez, who had testified as an expert witness during Sarah's trial, became instrumental in developing new self-defense training programs specifically designed for military personnel facing harassment from superior officers. Sergeant Martinez's martial arts training saved her life, but she should never have been in a position where she needed to use it. Our new training programs focus on de-escalation and escape techniques, while also ensuring that our personnel can defend themselves if all else fails. The impact of Sarah's case extended beyond the military to influence how sexual assault cases were handled in civilian law enforcement and corporate environments. Legal scholars studied her case as an example of how institutional failures can force victims into desperate situations, leading to calls for reform in various sectors where power imbalances create opportunities for predatory behavior. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the psychologist who had testified in Sarah's defense, found herself in demand as a consultant for organizations seeking to understand and prevent the systemic failures that had led to Major Blackwood's death. The Martinez case demonstrates what happens when institutions prioritize their reputation over the safety of the people they're supposed to protect. It's a cautionary tale that applies far beyond the military. Sarah herself completed her military service with distinction, ultimately choosing not to re-enlist when her contract expired. She had been offered opportunities for promotion and specialized assignments, but the trauma of the incident had changed her relationship with military service. "I still believe in the mission and the values of the military," she explained in her final interview as an active duty soldier, "but I need to process what happened and figure out who I am beyond this one terrible moment that defined my entire military career." After leaving the military, Sarah used her medical training and combat experience to work with veterans suffering from PTSD and military sexual trauma. Her unique perspective as someone who had both experienced and survived military sexual assault made her particularly effective in helping other victims heal and recover. She established a nonprofit organization focused on providing support services to military sexual assault survivors, using her own case as an example of how the system could work when victims were properly supported. The 167 witnesses who had been present during the inspection that day found their own lives changed by their involvement in the case. Many of them remained in contact with Sarah, forming a unique bond with someone they had helped save through their testimony. Several became advocates for military reform, using their platform as witnesses to one of the most significant military justice cases in recent history to push for continued improvements in how the armed forces handled sexual assault. Corporal Jake Williams, Sarah's closest friend and colleague during the incident, eventually left the military and joined Sarah's nonprofit organization. "That day changed all of us," Williams reflected. "We realized that we had a responsibility not just to our mission, but to each other." Sarah's courage in defending herself and then facing the court-martial inspired all of us to be better soldiers and better people. The base where the incident had occurred was eventually renamed in honor of the victims of military sexual assault, with a memorial established to remind future generations of military personnel about the importance of protecting their fellow service members from predatory behavior. The storage room where Major Blackwood died was converted into a victim advocacy center, symbolically transforming a place of violence into a place of healing and support. 5 years after the incident, Sarah was invited to speak at the base during the annual sexual assault awareness training. Standing in the same courtyard where 167 soldiers had witnessed the events that changed her life, she delivered a speech that captured both the pain and the hope that had emerged from her experience. "I never wanted to be here today, talking about what happened in that storage room. I wanted to serve quietly, save lives, and return home to build a family and a civilian career. But sometimes life forces us into moments where we have to choose between survival and surrender. I chose to survive, and that choice changed everything, not just for me, but for everyone who wears this uniform." Sarah's words resonated throughout the military, serving as both a reminder of how far the institution had come and a warning about how far it could fall if vigilance was not maintained. Her case had become more than just a legal victory. It had become a symbol of the possibility for justice and reform, even within the most rigid and traditional institutions.
10 years have passed since Sergeant Sarah Martinez made the split-second decision that saved her life and transformed the United States military's approach to sexual assault. The ripple effects of that moment in a storage room at Forward Operating Base Kandahar continue to influence military policy, legal precedent, and the lives of countless service members who have benefited from the reforms her case made possible. Sarah, now 36 years old, has built a new life far from the military world where she once served. Her nonprofit organization, the Martinez Foundation for Military Sexual Trauma Support, has helped thousands of veterans heal from experiences similar to her own. The foundation operates counseling centers in 12 cities across the United States, providing specialized therapy, legal assistance, and advocacy services to military sexual assault survivors. The foundation's headquarters, located in Sarah's hometown of San Antonio, Texas, houses a unique memorial wall featuring the names of service members who have died by suicide after experiencing military sexual trauma. Major Richard Blackwood's name is not on that wall, a deliberate choice that Sarah explained during the memorial's dedication. "We remember the victims, not the perpetrators. We honor those who suffered in silence, not those who caused that suffering." The annual Martinez Foundation Conference has become the premier gathering for advocates, researchers, and policymakers working on military sexual assault issues. The conference brings together survivors, legal experts, military leaders, and congressional representatives to share research, develop new policies, and support ongoing reform efforts.
The 2029 conference attracted over 3,000 attendees, including many of the 167 witnesses who had been present during the inspection at Forward Operating Base Kandahar. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the psychologist who had testified in Sarah's defense, has become one of the leading researchers in military sexual trauma. Her longitudinal study following sexual assault survivors in military settings has provided crucial data that continues to inform policy decisions. Sarah's case was the catalyst, but the real change has come from the systematic research and policy work that followed, Dr. Martinez explained during her keynote address at the Foundation's annual conference. The legal precedent established by Sarah's acquittal has been cited in dozens of subsequent military justice cases involving sexual assault and self-defense. The Martinez Standard, as it has become known in military legal circles, establishes clear guidelines for evaluating self-defense claims in cases where institutional failures have left victims without recourse through normal channels. Colonel Margaret Stevens, who presided over Sarah's court-martial, eventually rose to the rank of general and served as the military's first chief advocate for sexual assault prevention and response. In that role, she oversaw the implementation of many of the reforms that Sarah's case had made necessary. Every policy we've implemented, every training program we've developed, every structural change we've made can be traced back to the failures that led to that confrontation in the storage room, General Stevens reflected during her retirement ceremony. The military base where the incident occurred has become a model for sexual assault prevention and response. The Victim Advocacy Center that replaced the storage room where Major Blackwood died has helped hundreds of service members report harassment and assault with a 100% investigation rate and 0 cases of retaliation against victims. The base's commanding officers regularly host delegations from other military installations seeking to replicate their success in creating a safe environment for all personnel. Corporal Jake Williams, who had been the first to respond when Sarah reported the incident, eventually became a licensed clinical social worker specializing in military trauma. He joined the Martinez Foundation staff and now directs their crisis intervention program. Sarah's courage that day didn't just save her own life, it saved thousands of lives by forcing changes that protect people who might otherwise have found themselves in similar situations. The 167 witnesses who had been present during the inspection have followed diverse paths in the years since the incident. Many remained in military service and became advocates for reform within their units. Others left the military and pursued civilian careers, but continued to support the Foundation's work through donations and volunteer service. Several have become public speakers, sharing their perspectives on the importance of bystander intervention and institutional accountability. Private First Class Maria Santos, who had been one of the first to come forward with her own experiences of harassment by Major Blackwood, completed her military service and earned a law degree with specialization in military justice. She now works as a defense attorney for service members facing court-martial proceedings, with a particular focus on cases involving sexual assault and harassment. Sarah's case showed me that the system could work when people were willing to tell the truth and demand justice, Santos explained. Staff Sergeant Lisa Rodriguez, whose testimony about suppressed harassment complaints had been crucial to Sarah's defense, left the military shortly after the trial and became an investigator for the Department of Defense Inspector General's office. Her work focuses on identifying and correcting systemic failures in military sexual assault reporting and investigation procedures. I couldn't unsee what I had seen, Rodriguez said. I had to do something to make sure those kinds of cover-ups never happened again. The reforms implemented as a result of Sarah's case have had measurable impacts on military sexual assault rates and reporting. The independent prosecution system established by the Military Sexual Assault Reform Act has resulted in significantly higher conviction rates and has eliminated the ability of commanding officers to protect predators within their units. Annual surveys show increased confidence among service members in the military's commitment to addressing sexual assault and harassment. Perhaps most significantly, the cultural changes within the military have created an environment where potential predators know they can't count on institutional protection. The Good Old Boys network that had shielded Major Blackwood has been systematically dismantled, replaced by a culture of accountability and transparency that makes predatory behavior far more difficult to sustain. Sarah's personal journey has been one of healing and growth, though she acknowledges that the trauma of that day will always be part of her story. She completed her bachelor's degree in psychology and earned a master's degree in clinical social work, using her education to better understand and help others who have experienced similar trauma. Her thesis research focused on the long-term psychological effects of justified homicide in self-defense situations, contributing valuable insights to both academic and clinical understanding of this complex form of trauma. In 2027, Sarah married Dr. Michael Chen, a civilian trauma surgeon she met while volunteering at a veterans hospital. Their wedding was attended by many of the 167 witnesses from that day at Forward Operating Base Kandahar, creating an unusual but meaningful celebration that honored both her past struggles and future hopes. The couple has 2 young children and lives quietly in a suburb of San Antonio, Texas, where Sarah continues her foundation work while maintaining as normal a family life as possible. Sarah rarely grants interviews about her case, preferring to let her advocacy work speak for itself. However, in a recent conversation with a military historian documenting the changes in sexual assault policy, she reflected on the unexpected path her life had taken. "I became a medic because I wanted to save lives. I never imagined that saving my own life would end up saving so many others. But that's what happened, and I've learned to find meaning in that, even though I wish it had never been necessary." The storage room where Major Blackwood died has been preserved as part of the Victim Advocacy Center, not as a shrine to violence, but as a reminder of the consequences of institutional failure. A plaque near the entrance reads, "In memory of all victims of military sexual assault and in recognition that institutional failure to protect the vulnerable can have tragic consequences for everyone involved." The room now serves as a private counseling space where victims can share their experiences in complete confidentiality. The annual memorial service held at the base on the anniversary of the incident has become a powerful reminder of the ongoing need for vigilance in protecting service members from sexual assault and harassment. The service includes readings from letters written by sexual assault survivors who credit the reforms implemented after Sarah's case with giving them the courage to report their experiences and seek justice. Major Blackwood's family initially struggled with the public revelation of his predatory behavior, but eventually came to understand the importance of acknowledging the truth about his actions. His sister, Patricia Blackwood, issued a public statement in 2025. "My brother's death was a tragedy, but the greater tragedy would have been allowing his behavior to continue unchallenged. Sergeant Martinez did what she had to do to protect herself, and the changes that resulted from this case honor both his memory and the memories of all victims by ensuring that such situations never happen again." The legal precedent established by Sarah's case has influenced civilian law enforcement training as well. Police departments across the country now include specific modules on sexual assault by authority figures and the justified use of force in self-defense situations. The Martinez standard has been cited in civilian courts when victims of sexual assault have been forced to use violence to protect themselves from attackers in positions of authority. Congressional oversight of military sexual assault policies continues to reference Sarah's case as both an example of how bad things can get when systems fail and how much progress is possible when institutions commit to meaningful reform. Senator Patricia Williams, who sponsored the Military Sexual Assault Reform Act, often begins hearings on military sexual assault by referencing Sarah's case. "We must never forget that behind every policy failure are real people whose lives are affected by our decisions."
The Martinez Foundation has expanded beyond direct victim services to include research and policy advocacy. The Foundation's research division has published influential studies on the effectiveness of various intervention strategies, the long-term health impacts of military sexual trauma, and the economic costs of sexual assault in military settings. This research has informed policy decisions not just in the United States, but in NATO allies and other military organizations around the world. International military leaders have studied Sarah's case and the reforms that followed as a model for addressing sexual assault in their own forces. The Kandahar Protocols, named after the base where the incident occurred, have been adopted by military organizations in Canada, Australia, and several European nations as guidelines for preventing and responding to sexual assault within military hierarchies. Dr. Amanda Foster, the forensic pathologist who had examined Major Blackwood's body and testified about the biomechanics of his death, has become a leading expert in forensic analysis of self-defense cases.
Her testimony in Sarah's trial established new standards for evaluating the physical evidence in cases where victims claim to have acted in self-defense. The Martinez case taught us the importance of looking beyond the simple fact of death to understand the circumstances that led to that death, Dr. Foster explained during a recent conference on forensic pathology. The ripple effects of Sarah's case continue to influence military justice in unexpected ways. Training programs for military prosecutors now include specific modules on evaluating self-defense claims in sexual assault cases, emphasizing the importance of understanding the psychological and institutional factors that may limit a victim's options for seeking help through normal channels. Military defense attorneys receive similar training, focused on building effective defenses for clients who have been failed by the institutions they serve. The Military Defense Bar Association has established the Martinez Fellowship, providing specialized training for attorneys representing sexual assault victims in military justice proceedings. Perhaps most importantly, the case has influenced how the military selects and promotes its officers. Background investigations for promotion to major and above now include specific scrutiny of any complaints or concerns about inappropriate behavior toward subordinates. The Blackwood factor, as it's known in military personnel circles, has effectively ended the careers of numerous officers whose predatory behavior might previously have been overlooked or excused. As Sarah approaches the 10-year anniversary of the incident that changed her life, she reflects on the complex legacy of that day in the storage room. "I killed a man to save myself," she recently told a gathering of Foundation supporters. "That's a fact I live with every day. But I also know that his death led to changes that have protected thousands of other people from experiencing what I experienced. There's no satisfaction in that knowledge, only a sense of responsibility to continue the work." The 167 witnesses who were present that day have become an informal network of advocates and supporters who continue to check on each other and support the Foundation's work. Their annual reunion has become a powerful reminder of how ordinary people can become part of extraordinary change when they have the courage to tell the truth about what they've witnessed. The story of Sergeant Sarah Martinez and the night she was forced to kill Major Richard Blackwood in self-defense has become more than just a case study in military justice. It has become a testament to the power of individual courage to catalyze institutional change. A reminder that sometimes the most important battles are not fought against foreign enemies, but against the systems and cultures that fail to protect the vulnerable from those who would exploit their power. Today, every military installation in the United States displays a poster with Sarah's image and a simple message: "When institutions fail, individuals must act. When individuals act with courage, institutions can change." It's a legacy that Sarah never sought but has embraced, understanding that her willingness to fight for her own survival has made survival possible for countless others who followed in her footsteps. The storage room where it all began now serves as a place of healing rather than violence, a counseling center where victims can find the help that Sarah was denied. The shelving units that were damaged in the struggle have been replaced with comfortable seating and soft lighting, creating an environment of safety and support that stands in contrast to the terror that once filled that space. The final words belong to Sarah herself, from her speech at the Foundation's most recent conference. "I didn't choose to become a symbol or a catalyst for change. I just chose to survive." But survival, it turns out, can be the most powerful form of resistance. When we refuse to be victims, when we demand better from the institutions that are supposed to protect us, when we tell our stories despite the discomfort they cause, that's when change becomes possible. That's when the 167 witnesses in our own lives step forward to support us. That's when justice becomes more than just an idea. In the end, the story of Sarah Martinez is not just about one woman's fight for survival, or one man's predatory behavior, or even one institution's failures and reforms. It's about the power of truth to transform even the most entrenched systems, and the responsibility we all share to be witnesses for justice when it matters most. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.